Welcome to another episode of the Daily Database Insights. And I'm your favorite host. And the biggest question that we have now that we have installed our database servers, and most likely the question you're going to be answering from all your application developers is what about the logins or the credentials or the authentication? Now, you have a SQL Server database installed. The application needs to be able to connect to that database. It needs a way to connect, which brings us to the point you need to have an identity type that is going to be used to connect to your database. Before you connect to your database, absolutely you need to have a client that's going to be able to reach the database server. The client driver is going to be based on what type of application you're using. It could be a SQL native client, it could be a SQL Server ODBC driver, it could be a JDBC driver. Whatever client that your application or whoever needs to connect to the database is going to be needing is going to be specific to what they're trying to do. But before they can connect, they need to have a login, and a login can be created on SQL Server. And the logins are created based on how they're going to be authenticated. The process of authentication means that the database engine needs to validate that the identity is really what it says it is, and the password ties back to that specific identity. So there are several authentication methods. Now, if I click on the start button here, or let's say I want to connect to SQL Server, Microsoft has multiple authentication methods that have been baked in. The fast authentication, which is often the default authentication, is the Windows authentication, if you can see my screen here. And the default is probably the most secured method to connect to your SQL Server. It means that Windows is going to be the main authenticator in this case. It's going to be either your Active Directory or it's going to be your local Windows authentication method. Then if you look down here, we have SQL Server authentication. In this case, it means that SQL Server stores and manages the login credentials, that is username and passwords, within its own master database. So whenever you are trying to recover passwords for a specific database that pretty much uses SQL authenticated method, master database is going to be a database that you must make sure you back up properly. And then when you go to Azure, we have all these other different type of authentication: Microsoft Entra MFA, password integrated service principal, managed identity, Entra default. Now, in SQL Server, you can have mixed mode authentication. In SQL Azure databases, you can have as well mixed mode authentication, which is going to be probably Microsoft Entra MFA and SQL Server authentication. On-prem, which is our SQL Server on-prem, we can configure multi-authentication or mixed mode. The way you get to this page is you go to the properties of the SQL Server instance, and then it launches the server properties. Then you come to the security page. Then you have your server authentication method. When you do not have a mixed mode is going to be your SQL Server and Windows authentication mode. Then when you try to connect using your SQL authenticated account, you're going to get an error telling you that the SQL Server authentication method is not enabled. So let's do this. Let me try to connect here. Everything is frozen. Let me try to connect from this one here. It's running on my laptop. Right, so I'm gonna use SQL Server authentication, SA, and then I'm gonna try to punch in the password. Of course, I don't wanna try to encrypt it for now. Then I'll try to connect, and that connected. And the reason why that connected is probably because that is SA. That is strange. It should not connect because we are only on Windows Authentication mode, which probably means that either my SQL Server Management Studio is not recording that correctly. Let me try connecting. Let me check the server properties here. That is very strange. But I should not have connected with that SQL Authenticator because it's not on mixed mode, which means what I should have actually experienced was a failed login, and then the next step would have been to come and enable the SQL Server mixed mode, which is what I'm going to do here. And this often is a script that alters something on your registry, and that's what it's doing. It's going to enable that mode in the registry, so the login mode. So once I execute that, 0 rows affected, probably because this was already there. Okay, so what I'm gonna do is I want to change it back to let me use the GUI. Seems like the SMS is this SQL Server Management Studio seems like it has some issues. Well, now once you enable that, you have to restart your SQL Server for it to take effect. So that's exactly what I'm going to do, and we're going to know here real quick what exactly we have running. And while that is happening, I am going to connect to well, let me restart this first. I'll restart my SQL Server instance. Alright, my SQL Server is restarted, and this is exactly what I was trying to show you. Alright, let's go back there on my SQL Server instance, and I am going to try to connect again using SA. For some weird reason, it still connects. One second. Well, let me check the authentication method. Now it is on Windows Authentication mode. I mean on mixed mode. So let me take it back to Windows Authentication mode. So it says some of the configuration changes will not take effect until SQL Server is restarted. Alright, so now we've taken it back to Windows. Let's restart that. Again, I'll pause it and we'll resume once it's restarted. Alright, it's restarted. Now I'm gonna connect using the SQL Authenticated account, and now you can see that it's struggling to connect. Seems like it's truly indeed in Windows mode and not allowing any SQL Authenticated account. We're gonna see the error here in a moment, and then you can see here that the error, a network related or instance specific error, occurred while establishing a connection to SQL Server. Now, seems like it's not able to connect. Okay, so what we need to do is we'll come back to that instance and we can check the logs. To see exactly what really happened. So I will read the logs, and then I'll scroll all the way down. That's not the correct log I'm looking for. That is, login failed for user SA reason. An attempt to log in using SQL authentication failed. This is the error that you need to be looking out for. So it tells you that this tells you that SQL Server is not configured for SQL authentication. Now, how to fix this? You come back to your properties, onto your security, configure mixed mode, and again, for that to work, you have to restart your SQL Server instance. And now when we try it, it's actually going to connect. So that is the first thing. If you are having any issues trying to set up the type of authentication on your databases, that's how you do it. Now the next part is for you to be able to have your logins created. You're going to decide based on the type of application or the type of authentication that that application is supporting to either create SQL Server authenticated accounts or to create Windows or Active Directory authenticated accounts. SQL Server authenticated accounts are really easy to create. I can just go ahead and do write a script here, create login, and then I'm gonna create a service account called PeopleSoft with a password, and it's gonna be, let's say, test. If only I can type. I want to make sure that I don't check the policy, and I want to make sure that I don't have a password that expires, and I can declare my default database to be the PeopleSoft database. If only I can type. So if I create this login, it is created, and this is going to be your SQL authenticated login. So I can connect as SVC PSoft test SVC PSoft test. Oh, cannot open the default database. Now what I would need to do is maybe create a username on that default database. So use create a user SVC PSoft for login SVC PSoft. So when I go ahead and do that, now I have a user there. So when I try it again, try to connect, and now I can connect. So that is how you create your SQL Authenticated account. So if you have anybody who is trying to understand how to create logins or SQL Authenticated accounts, you must show them this video. And if they still have problems doing that, ask them to contact me because I can point them in the right direction. I'm gonna walk you through the next parts of creating the Active Directory logins on the next video. Thank you.